Hey everyone, welcome back. So this is probably mostly for Philosophy 1301, my introduction to philosophy sections. It may be for asynchronous, it may be for in-person, maybe for online synchronous. This video is going to be about Plato's Apology. Now, Plato's Apology focuses more on the philosophical character of Socrates than the philosophical character of Plato. Socrates didn't write anything down. Um, I'm not sure if it's that we don't have access to it, but I'm pretty sure it's just that he didn't write anything down. He's known purportedly, as far as we know, for going around asking the town of Athens. This is Socrates, not Plato. Asking the town of Athens different questions about virtue and knowledge and truth and the gods they believe in. And in the Apology, Socrates, for example, says that he asks the craftsmen, the poets, and the politicians. And we'll read it together. And they all give unsatisfactory answers for what virtue is, or what excellence is, or what wisdom is for Socrates. So he keeps asking them questions, and he doesn't tell them that they're like. I mean, he somewhat tells them they're wrong, but mostly he forces them to see how they are actually wrong, right? So he asks them questions more than just says, "No, I disagree with you for these reasons." And instead, he'll say, "What about this?" And the person will say, "Well, yes, I agree with that." And then he'll go, "Okay, so then connect that to this thing." And they're like, "Oh, oh." And then a lot of people got mad at him for those experiences. And after about 70 something, well, he was doing that for about 30 to 40 years. And then in his 70s, they sentenced him to death. Um, the apology is his defense at his trial, not in a way, it's a defense of why he shouldn't be killed. But it's more a defense that he's going to commit to whatever he was doing, and specifically the philosophical life is worth committing to. Um, so commitment is a big theme in the apology. It's a defense, but not necessarily one that's meant to be like, it doesn't like just start with innocence as an assumption. I mean, it's more of a peace of mind that Socrates has. And we have two guiding questions for the apology. There's some more about Plato and Socrates that I want to tell you for context before we read the apology, before we think about the guiding questions. It's more, this section of our course is more narrative based than Bergson was. Bergson was pretty intuitive. I don't want to say conceptual because Bergson explicitly shows us why concepts are insufficient for the intuitions that will help you navigate philosophical discourse and the writings in the history of philosophy. Um, so what else I want to tell you about the guiding let's see. Well, since we're talking about the apology, let's look at the guiding questions. They're basically two. And the second one is kind of maybe easier to parse. Why can no one harm Socrates? And how is this related to virtue? And then the answer to that is kind of, in a way, the same answer as number one, to this different question. How is Socrates able to confidently, i.e., with serene spiritual and moral beauty of character, face whatever may come his way, including his probable death sentence and impending death? Well, he's able to do that because no one can harm him. But why can no one harm him? Um, how can he trust his virtue? What does harm actually mean? Is the answer is that Socrates is the only one that can harm himself. I am the only one that can harm myself. You're the only one that can harm yourself. Because the self is the virtue or the purity of soul, the peace of mind that you have on a daily basis, the expansion or the diminution of your consciousness and perception. Um, it's a lovely text. It's easy to read. It's easy to follow. It's mostly a monologue. Socrates has such a peace about him that is just so pleasant. Um, One of the things he says is that philosophy is just worth doing over again. Um, Even when you think you have good answers to philosophical problems. He says two things. One, It's just inherently pleasant and worthwhile and intrinsically good to talk about philosophy with others, to ask them, or to develop people who haven't thought about it yet, to continue discussing it with people you can help or you can teach. But even if you know the answers, you can still consider different positions. And you can practice being good, but you should also study being good. It's the idea that studying being good is part of the practice of being good. And it's also just inherently pleasant to do so. I've said a lot of these things. I'm just repeating myself. Um, this is the text where the famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living," comes from. There are a few jokes in it that I really enjoy. One of them is that when Socrates is asked, so they decide that he's guilty, and then they say we want the punishment to be death. Socrates has a chance to rebuttal. And instead of saying, well, he does go through the options of like a fine, imprisonment. He says, I don't have money to pay a fine. So I'm basically going to be imprisoned. I don't deserve to be imprisoned. And so he just says, I don't deserve any of these things. He says, what I do deserve is free food, just like the Olympian victors get after winning the Olympics. Because they make you think yourself happy, but I actually make you happy. And so that's maybe the other point that's really important here is that Socrates shows us that true wealth comes from the excellence of the soul, not from the outward trappings of what you produce with that excellence of the soul. So he says that virtue produces wealth, not the other way around. Now, virtue is a Greek word that arete, Arete. I'm so sorry, I'm not even showing you these guiding questions. Normally my students in person would point that out. That's my bad. Um, so yeah, why can no one harm Socrates? And how is this related to virtue? Make sure this is, yep. And then one, how is Socrates able to confidently, i.e., with serene spiritual and moral beauty of character, face whatever may come his way, including his probable death sentence and impending death? Well, because no one can harm him. And why can no one harm him? Because harm is something only that only happens with a kind of self-corruption of the integrity of of excellence and virtue, and your ability to trust yourself in a way to kind of move swiftly and urgently and impulsively. Okay. Now, I also want to tell you about the Euthyphro, just very briefly, not much at all. But it happens in a narrative, chronological, historical sense. Um, the Euthyphro is a story told right before Socrates goes into the courthouse to face the trial. And so it's often taught together. I've decided in my intro course that um, I don't have the day for it, but I can quickly, run through the argument with you. Um, However, before we do that, I actually want to talk about, so we're going to use some of these resources probably. Um, yeah. I want to talk about, what was I looking for? Not craft, not arete. Oh, the middle period. That is going to be with the apology, isn't it? No, that's with the Euthyphro. Okay. Yeah. So I do want to talk about this. And we can look at this is what I did teach with the Euthyphro. Why do the gods love what is pious? Do the gods love what is pious because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? Does God determine what is right? It's pious because the gods love it. Or does what is right determine what God loves? Does right determine itself? Um, there's parallels with common law, where a community or a jury decides what is right, um, versus civil law, where a codification or a code or a universal rule that must apply evenly to everybody everywhere in all circumstances and situations. Um, that would be more like what is right determines what God loves. Um, And then you can also find parallels with utilitarianism and deontology. So Kant, deontology, following universal rules, and this really does play into the apology too, because Socrates says that he could have brought his children and his wife to persuade the emotions of the jurors, like most people do at these trials, but he didn't think that was how justice should be determined. And they accused him of believing in different gods in the city. So if he had not submitted to the laws of the gods, of universal truth and rule, and listening to the sort of divine voice that he heard himself personally, divine sign that told him when not to do things. If he hadn't been doing those things, or if he had tried to persuade the jurors with an appeal to their emotions through bringing his family, like I said, um, he would have been he says he would have self-incriminated. He would have done exactly the thing they accused him of doing. Um, so he also is kind of leaning more towards deontology and universal law and finding consistent rules that will be respectable. He says that Athens, they're making a joke of Athens by killing him. Somebody else will come after him that is more, the one who comes after me will not be as patient with you, is kind of what he says. And because you didn't actually address the issues I pointed out, it's going to be harder for you in the future. And they're going to be a little bit more aggressive with you because you didn't keep up with the only thing you can ever do is be a good person to outrun new generations of criticism. Um, and he goes, I'm about to die. I'm 70 something years old. You guys could have waited like half a decade. You didn't have to make a fool of yourself. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much the gist of the apology. Um, it's the gist of the Euthyphro as well. We're going to dig into them and read them, but I also want to cover, because we're going to go into the Republic in a bit, in a week or two, or in a few days, actually. I guess in my intro class, you should be doing Republic second half of week 4. Um, so let's look at, if you want to take a look at this board, you know where to find them on the Instagram. You can pause the video here and zoom in, probably. I can also zoom in for you. That's probably better anyway. Let's do that. And then, yeah, so there's 3 kind of periods in the periodization of Plato's works, not Socrates. There's early, middle, and late. Even the early dialogues aren't necessarily the voice of Socrates, but the apology in particular, we can assume some interpersonal fidelity to what was said at Socrates' trial. There was a real trial. Um, Plato is probably putting his own positions and his own, not really his own, I mean, because Socrates was the first, right? So he wants to respect Socrates. He's going to want to accurately reflect his teachers. He was there at the trial. He's quoted in the either his brother is mentioned or he's directly mentioned too. In the middle dialogues, like the Republic, Socrates is still the main figure. Um, so that's the other thing is that Socrates is the mouthpiece of Plato in most of his dialogues. There are some late ones where the Eleatic visitor or the stranger is the main kind of justified position, but they're all written in dialogue format. I think the apology is the most monological, the most one-dimensional, one perspective. Um, and it's kind of easy to see why because it's pretty um it has a lot of integrity. It kind of is what it is. It's coherent. It's about the pure simplicity of excellence and purity. I repeated purity. The pure simplicity of excellence of soul. There's a lightweightness to it. And what Sontag would call transparence. It is what it is. It shines forth. It breaks through. Transparency is for art, but they're how they are. They don't need to be quantified or qualified beyond that. Okay. Yeah, you can see a lot of the notes on here, right? Like the late has a mature voice. So in the early ones, we can kind of assume that, like I said, it's more of Socrates' positions, but really what they are is Socrates' method, which is deconstructing. It's a Socratic method. It's not deconstruction. There is some deconstructive component to it, but deconstruction with Derrida involves inverting the poles of a traditional hierarchy and showing how the two opposite sides of the poles um, kind of diffuse into each other. And so you invert traditional, like I said, power structures of knowledge, actually. That's not quite what Socrates is doing. Socrates is instead just asking for universal definitions. He wants to seek the forms. So the forms are important for Plato. The forms are like we criticized with Bergson. They are these universal things which give all desks their deskness, all cats their catness. Not the character from, well, I don't want to invoke any copyright infringements, but all dogs their dogness, all animals their animalness. It's these like categorizations, these forms, and the forms can coalesce together. So the form of piety in the Euthyphro is one of the forms of justice, and justice is a bigger circle around piety. I might have drawn that right here. So piety and then care of humans and animals. Piety is the care of the gods in this model. It's right here where the mouse is. Um, anyway, in the early dialogues, Socrates is using this Socratic method to ask people questions that they have to answer themselves and to lead them through this path of self-reflection that should jar things ago. I'm actually thinking about what you're saying, what you're making me say, not just what you're saying, but what you're making me say. And I'm like, okay, maybe I see the issue, right? Um, in the middle dialogues, the Socratic figure, Socrates, and I say the Socratic figure because it's not actually the historical Socrates. Whether or not Socrates went to all these places and spoke to all these people is not necessarily documented. A lot of them, I think, well, given the age gap between Plato and Socrates, about 50 years, unless Plato was wealthy, unless Plato was also a historian, I don't, so he wasn't at these things that Socrates went to before Socrates was put to death. Unless Plato was also a historian, uh, a lot of this is going to have to be necessarily fictitious. I think Plato likely refined his canon and created an overall narrative across things. I'm not as sold on the classic periodization of like Plato wrote the early dialogues when he was young and he wrote the middle dialogues when he was in his midlife. I think he probably continued to edit his stuff. I used to think that. And the older I get, the less I want to edit my old stuff. So I don't know. Um, about 400 BCE. And then, yeah, the late dialogues, quote unquote, are more confident. So they're mostly the same positions as the middle dialogues, but instead of them being like tentative postulations or uh, positing things like it might be this guy's, and then different perspectives analyze it. Um, Socrates is very, well, the different voices, the different figures that are presenting the true ideas are more confident. Um, Last thing I want to talk about with Plato is the two reasons I think about for why he chose the dialogical format. Um, there's a tendency in philosophy to try to do it separate from reality, separate from the outside world. I don't, after doing philosophy for a long time, I don't really buy into inside and outside anymore. Um, but there's a tendency to think of like just the ideas or just the dualistic mind separate from matter, separate from the body, the mind and the body separate. And the armchair philosophy of just mind reflection without a lot of life experiences and without mapping onto the intuitive forms of reality themselves is a way of doing philosophy that I'm critical of. And so I think the dialogues get past that, I think, by always presenting the ideas in human relation, a figure, a living human character is supposed to experience this stuff, and presents it from that wrapping in that presentation, right? There's no abstraction, there's no contortion that really can get too far away from humans considering ideas, which is what philosophy should always be, is humans experiencing things. Does this work for our human well-being? And that's what one of the big themes in ancient philosophy, aside from virtue, is the good life, or what it means to live a good life, what it means to live well. So eudaimonia, or living well or thriving. quite literally means a deep state of calm and peace with your inner daemon or your inner voice. So, with the Apology, for example, Socrates heard an inner voice that was supposed to be related to the oracle at Delphi and the god Apollo, who told Socrates that he was the wisest person on earth. Socrates didn't believe it, so he went around asking people to prove that they knew answers he didn't have the answers to. And he said, well, actually, I don't know anything more than they do. I just know that I don't know things. And I guess that makes me the wisest. I guess that's how the Oracle of Delphi is correct. Um, Guys, if you want to be like me, you just got to start asking these questions, is basically what Socrates tells the jurors who want to kill him. There's something kind of comforting. He's accused of corrupting the youth. There's something kind of comforting about having Socrates as a seminal figure as a philosopher because like it's the more you do philosophy, the more you understand, but it's really peaceful. Um, okay. Pretty much all I want to say about Plato big picture right now. We'll do more Plato stuff once we get to the Republic. Here we're focusing on Socrates. So here's a little bit more about the Euthyphro. Something he says that he explains like being loved or something loved versus being loved, something moved versus being moved. It is only something moved while it is being moved. And so the static property comes from the transitive state. Um, and the transitive state must then derive from something else that is not the property, which must be the forms. And so it's actually kind of like a series of integrals. Like if Bergson shows us how we can go from the property that depends on the motion to the motion itself, which is from the be or the be or the something moved, something carried to being carried, something is carried to something is being carried. Um, from the yeah, then we can go another, but Plato takes it back to the immutable and says that immutable must be somewhere else. Um, and this actually makes the most sense for something that is immutable and ethereal and like virtue or like justice or like morality or like excellence or like the soul. And so if you want to objectify or objectively ground against hedonism or against just really against egoism, self-interested egoism to the detriment of others, um, if you want to ground some of these objective moral or ethical principles or ethical justifications, we call them grounds, final stopping points at which you're like, you got to listen to it. And it should be persuasive to most humans, most rational minds. And now I sound like a Kantian. Um, anyway, that's another kind of intro to the forms through the lens of the Euthyphro. Here, I like this one down here. Or let's read these two. Something God loved is being loved because it is innately lovable, loveworthy, good, pious. And so that innately lovable, loveworthy, good, pious is the form of those things. Um, if eternal modes were the same as their particular participations such as something God loved would cause movement and action such as being loved. So something else other than the participations must cause the action or the movement, which is what the forms can do that the participations in the forms cannot do. It sounds like just a mental gymnastics thing. But should those mental gymnastics be possible if they're not eidetically valid? That's a meaningful question. Which reverses still the notion that temporary transitive properties or states, participations only hold for the duration of the relevant participation in the form. So that's the other kind of thing is that if the reason why the participations can't be the final grounds is that the final ground shouldn't be transitive. Um, it shouldn't be so ephemeral. Okay, this is more about the Euthyphro than I plan on discussing. So let's go back to the apology. Um, I'm glad we covered we lectured on the Euthyphro. We're not going to read it. We will read a summary in paragraph that kind of, like I said, hits a lot of these points and scaffolds us, kind of primes us into the apology. Apology is a great place to start an intro course. Um, it's really close to me whether I start there or Bergson. Um, but they should make sense together. Knowing and ethics. I think you kind of have to get them at the same time. In fact, one of my old mentors called it the ethico-epistemological connection, so, or epistemico-political, meaning that we can't act outside of our belief systems or outside of our affect, and so we're ethically constrained by our knowledge base or by our belief systems. Spinoza and affect. Anyway, um, he says that a short, honest life is better than a long wickedness, and that wickedness is quicker than death and harder to outrun than death. Um, it's easy to get away from death by choosing wickedness, basically. Uh, I think I said this. If he's not worried about dying, also because death would be either a dreamless sleep or hanging out with heroes, what he calls it. He doesn't say hanging out. Um, he basically says that he would have a chance. Sorry for the Twitch. He would have a chance to talk to other great philosophers and thinkers or like war heroes, people who would be knowledgeable, and he would get to discuss philosophy some more basically. So either he has nothingness, or the something would be another chance for philosophy. And both are pretty reasonable, um, reasonably fine choices. These heroes, the great masters, he might use that phrase, but that's the phrase I think Bergson used. Martyr of justice and truth, confidence in virtue, conviction of consistency, awareness of ignorance and the fear of death. Yeah, he doesn't know if death is good or bad. Conviction of consistency, right? He wants to just like stick to his principles and keep doing what he said he was going to do. He's confident in the purity of his soul. He's the only one that can harm him. His own wickedness is the only harm. And so he has self-respect. He respects himself. Okay. The old charges, yeah, he says there are old charges and new charges. The old charges are um, stuff that they've been saying for decades. So he went to the Oracle of Delphi when he was like in his 40s, and then for like 30 years he's been going around asking people questions. So it was a long process. Um, the more recent charges they've brought him on are corrupting the youth and in believing in different gods than the city. So like that's the more recent stuff of going around asking these questions. But the older charges that they've just been like that the youth and that the 30-year-olds have been hearing about since they were kids that nobody formally brought and accused him of, but like the rumors against him, these prejudices, these affects, these beliefs that get in the way of justice and true understanding and ethics. Um, those charges he starts off the apology with, and he says they're believing in things above the sky and below the earth. And he says this is what they say about all philosophers when they don't have anything better to criticize them for. Um, he also says that it's wrong because he goes around asking people about ethics and their soul and how they should live a good life with their community and their family. It's very grounded in reality and in other people. It's not about abstracted, like I was saying with Plato, right? It's not about with the dialogical format. Oh, the other point of the dialogical format I forgot to mention is to get all the different perspectives in contest, air them out, and show how each one is wrong. It's a lot more, it's very intuitive. Some philosophers can do this in prose, Um, but it can be tedious, to be honest. Descartes, for example, says that he's only concerned with giving the examples that any person who's actually trying to listen and learn would be able to follow. He says there's no point trying to persuade somebody who's not listening. Plato, in the Republic, the beginning of the Republic, also says, Glaucon says, if they won't listen, there's nothing we can do. Absolutely not. Um, Adamantus wants to, I think it's Adamantus, not Adamantus. The names get weird for me. Anyway, if you won't listen, then he can't stop them, he can't help them, he can't teach them. Okay, and then making the worst argument the stronger. This is another reason why it's helpful to think about the Euthyphro, because if you actually read some of that language, which I can take us to in a minute, right before we go to the apology. So let's look at that. Um, it can be hard to follow what he's saying. I think this is probably the crux. This is the crux of confusion. That's another great point. The early Socratic dialogues are meant to induce aporia. Aporia is just a height of confusion, a tension of alertness that brings one to some kind of fruitful, productive effort. Bergson really, I guess, also with the images and he says that they're supposed to construct a sort of tension in the other person who is being led to intuition and led to concrete duration. Um, but aporia is supposed to do that as well. So by the end of the Euthyphro, um, Socrates has to go inside. He's asking him, he says, I'm about to go be put on trial. Please, Euthyphro, you're accusing your dad of murder and he's going to be killed for it. How do you know so much about what the gods think is true and what's not true and what's good and what's not good? Please teach me. If you teach me, I might be able to go save my butt when I go talk to Athens and tell them, hey, 501 jurors, I shouldn't die. Um, by the end of it, Socrates doesn't have good answers. Euthyphro says he has to go. He's kind of annoyed with him. He's like, and Socrates says we have to start again. And Euthyphro says, I don't have time. Uh, Again, that practice, that repetition of the excellence of the virtue, if it's just good to do philosophy over and over again, it's kind of a theme in Plato. Spend your days discussing excellence and being a good person. Um, they get aired out. The point of the height of confusion, right? So the first conclusion of the Euthyphro is that the gods determine what is pious, and then Socrates critiques that, and then Euthyphro thinks that at first. And then Euthyphro eventually agrees, okay, the pious determines what the gods love. And this is kind of where we determine that Socrates determines that. But then they flip again and they go back to um, thinking about that second level of like piety as care for the gods. And then there's other kinds of care. And so what do the other kinds of care have that piety has? That what can the other kinds of care teach, and the other forms of justice teach us about piety as a specific form of justice? Um, But I think if you read this, you'll be like, oh, it's so confusing. I don't think you wouldn't kill somebody for it. I hope you wouldn't. But if the God loved and the pious were the same, my dear Euthyphro, then if the pious was being loved because it was, and this is what I tried to explain with the green notes. If the pious was being loved because it was pious, the God loved would also be being loved because it was God loved. And if the God loved was God loved because it was being loved for the gods, then the pious would also be pious because it was being loved by the gods. But now you see they are in opposite cases of being altogether different from each other. The one is such as to be loved because it is being loved. The other is being loved because it is such as to be loved. I'm afraid, Euthyphro, that when you were asked what piety is, you did not wish to make its nature clear to me, but you told me an affect or a quality of it. something transitive, something non-formal, not a form, not a universal, consistent thing, not immutable, as Bergson says. That the pious has the quality of being loved by all the gods, but you have not yet told me what the pious is. Now, if you, and it's kind of like because he's trying to ontologize it or find the immutable character of it that he's begging the question. But that's fine. Now, if you will, do not hide things from me, but tell me again from the beginning what piety is, whether being loved by the gods or having some other quality. We shall not quarrel about that, but be keen to tell me what the pious and the impious are. I think for me, like the aporia that I got somewhere in the page before and in that paragraph helped me come to the conclusions I showed you in the green about that there is that middle conclusion here that what is right determines what the gods love, but they don't really like land on it for some reason, and they keep going and they circle around. Um, so that's like making the worst argument the stronger, and that's the old charges. It's one of the old charges. Let's read this intro to Euthyphro real quick. Read the intro to the Apology, and let's just kind of see how far we can get in the Apology in the next 4 or 5 minutes. Euthyphro is surprised to meet Socrates near the King Archon's court. For Socrates is not the kind of man to have business with courts of justice. Socrates explains that he is under indictment by one Meletus for corrupting the young and for not believing in the gods in whom the city believes. After a brief discussion of this, Socrates inquires about Euthyphro's business at court and is told that he is prosecuting his own father for the murder of a laborer who is himself a murderer. Uh, So the laborer was a murderer, and the father left the bound and gagged and like tied up the laborer who was a murderer um in a ditch while he went to the courts to figure out what to do. After he figured out what to do and came back, the person had died of dehydration, I think. So there's like a sort of like distinction there where it's even more extremely easy to sympathize with a father. Most people, I think, would take the side of the family. It's like, I understand why this happened. He wasn't a good person to begin with. Maybe he brought the death upon himself by being a murderer to begin with. In Socrates' view, only the state or only the law or the government can make that decision. Only the leader can make that decision. Otherwise, you just have I guess anarchy. But recent discussions of anarchy just means that there's no hierarchy. And in Plato's city, the ruled agree that the rulers should be in charge. This is really a way that the ruler can lead and ensure that no harm comes of the people without creating a hierarchy over the people can still exist with them and relate to them and be alongside them. And I would consider even that kind of uh, orienting and relating to each other, if it's non-hierarchical relations and the decisions made are excellent and healthy for people, uh, I would consider that anarchism. Because anarchism on the left should be the utmost freedom and the utmost empowerment for everybody equally. Freedom isn't just somebody can't stop me, it's also I have the resources I need to try new things. Okay, sorry for getting distracted. But yeah, his family and friends believe his course of action to be impious to accuse his father, but Euthyphro explains that in this they are mistaken and reveal their ignorance of the nature of piety. This naturally leads Socrates to ask, what is piety? And the rest of the dialogue is devoted to a search for a definition of piety, illustrating the Socratic search for universal definitions of ethical terms, to which a number of early Platonic dialogues are devoted. As usual, no definition is found that satisfies Socrates. The Greek term hosion means, in the first instance, the knowledge of the proper ritual and prayer and sacrifice, and of course its performance, as Euthyphro himself defines it in 14b. But obviously, Euthyphro uses it in the much wider sense of pious conduct generally, such as his own, e.g. E.g. means such as, i.e., which we don't think you've seen i.e. yet. I.e. means in other words. So if you want to, like, if I want to say, My sister went to Chevron or uh I say my sister went to the nail salon. This might be a gender coded example. My sister went to the ranch, i.e., my sister went to ride horses. So there's like the i.e. So you would say my sister went to the ranch, i.e., to ride horses. The two is where the kind of like insert fork happens. There's a fork in the sentence, and it follows the same syntactical structure in the sentence with i.e. But e.g. is like listing off examples that that definition applies to. So instead of restating it to make it more clear, um, with a syntactic fork, um, yeah, you're giving examples. And in that sense, the word is practically equivalent to righteousness, which is the justice of the republic, the transition being by way of conduct pleasing to the gods. Besides being an excellent example of the early so-called Socratic dialogues, Euthyphro contains several passages with important philosophical implications. These include those in which Socrates speaks of the one form presented by all the actions that we call pious, as well as the one in which we are told that the gods love what is pious because it is pious. It is not pious because the gods love it. Another passage clarifies the difference between genus and species. Okay. I don't think we'll have much time to get into the actual meat of the apology, but let's read this too. The apology professes to be a record of the actual speech that Socrates delivered in his own defense at the trial. This claim makes the question of its historicity more acute than in the dialogues in which the conversations themselves are mostly fictional, and the question of historicity is concerned only with how far the theories that Socrates is represented as expressing were those of the historical Socrates. Here, however, we are dealing with a speech that Socrates made as a matter of history. How far is Plato's account accurate? We should always remember that the ancients did not expect historical accuracy in the way we do. On the other hand, Plato makes it clear that he was present at the trial, 34a, 38b. Moreover, if, as is generally believed, the apology was written not long after the event, many Athenians would remember the actual speech, and it would be a poor way to vindicate the master, which is the obvious intent, to put a completely different speech into his mouth. This is what I was saying earlier, and I am indebted to G.M.A. Grube, I believe is who this is. Yeah, G.M.A. Group for the translation and this wonderful summary. That's how a citation should happen, folks, because I paraphrased, orally paraphrased what I learned from this. Moreover, and I try to give you the primary sources where I learned these things from philosophers too. Moreover, if some liberties could no doubt be allowed, but the main arguments and the general tone of the defense must surely be faithful to the original. The beauty of language and style is certainly Plato's, but the serene spiritual and moral beauty of character belongs to Socrates. That's where the guiding question comes from, too. It is a powerful combination. Athenian juries were very large, in this case 501, and they combined the duties of jury and judge as we know them by both convicting and sentencing. Obviously, it would have been virtually impossible for so large a body to discuss various penalties and decide on one. The problem was resolved rather neatly, however, by having the prosecutor, after conviction, assess the penalty he thought appropriate, followed by a counter-assessment by the defendant. So that's why there's three parts to this the apology. The defense before the conviction, and then the conviction is the first cut. And the second part is Socrates explaining what he should get instead of the penalty they want. And then there's the second cut, which is them deciding that it's going to be the death penalty that the prosecutor proposed. And then the third section of Socrates speaking, where he says, "All right, well, whatever. I know I'm good. Death isn't bad." There's another dialogue afterwards. I'll Google which one it is specifically. It's either the Credo or the Meno. I think it's the Meno. Plato. That's when he drinks it. Escape. There's one where his friends come to break him out. No, I think it's the Credo. Uh, There's one where his friend's trying to break him out of prison. Like literally break a hole in the wall, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, okay. And um, I forget how you turn AI off. I wish I would be Googling things without AI because of the water usage. I need to wrap this up, guys. Um, I've got some other stuff to do that I need to work on and then come back later and get you some more content. Um, but yeah, three parts to the apology. And so anyway, later he just decides like again, he wants the jury and he wants the people of Athens to be consistent and like have integrity and universality and principles, I guess, to mean what they say and say what they mean. And so the jury expected him to escape. They knew that he would escape. One of the things he says is, I can't go practice philosophy elsewhere. Um, I'm from here, I'm from Athens. If my own family, culture, friends, and neighbors can't tolerate me, I'm not so arrogant as to think that some other different culture would be more receptive to me. I love that phrase. I love that idea. Um, my home culture is not particularly receptive to philosophy. I'm not sure if there are many home cultures that are, but uh, there are other parts about me that are not that are not, they didn't come from philosophy. And so the way that I explain things, while philosophical, is still a little bit Southern, Texan. And so I feel a sort of nativity or nativeness to the community that I want to help too. Anyway, the counter assessment by the defendant where he says he deserves free food. Plato and some friends agree to spot him the fee, so he requests a fine instead, the minimum fine, I think. The jury would then decide between the two. This procedure generally made for moderation on both sides. Thus, the apology is in three parts. The first and major part is the main speech, followed by the counter assessment. And finally, the last words to the jury, both to those who voted for the death sentence and those who voted for acquittal. And he says, I think he actually kind of focuses on like, I'd rather spend my time talking to people who acquitted me and want to talk to me. The word apology is a transliteration, not a translation of the Greek apologia, which means defense. So it's kind of a cognate by being a transliteration. It just literally translates over or transitions over. There is certainly nothing apologetic about the speech. Um, okay, let's do the first paragraph. I do not know, men of Athens, how my accusers affected you. As for me, I was almost carried away in spite of myself, so persuasively did they speak. And yet hardly anything of what they said is true. Of the many lies they told, one in particular surprised me, namely that you should be careful not to be deceived by an accomplished speaker like me, that they were not ashamed to be immediately proved wrong by the facts when I showed myself not to be an accomplished speaker at all, that I thought was most shameless on their part. Unless indeed they call an accomplished speaker the man who speaks the truth. I like this part too. He says that he just lets it come out however it comes out. If they mean that I would agree that I am an orator, but not after their own manner, after their manner, for indeed, if they mean that, I would agree that I am an orator, but not after their manner, for indeed, as I say, practically nothing they said was true. From me you will hear the whole truth, though not by Zeus, gentlemen, expressed in embroidered and stylized phrases like theirs, but things spoken at random and expressed in the first words that come to mind. There's an earnestness. I love that earnestness of trying to explain something from like a core understanding. Um, for I put my trust in the justice of what I say, and let none of you expect anything else. It would not be fitting at my age, as it might be for a young man, to toy with words when I appear before you. I'd love to keep going. I'm gonna have to cut it right now. Thank you guys for being here. No pet attacks, no animals around. Um, Thanks for sticking with it. This is it'll be a good series. We'll probably have two more videos of just reading, maybe just one. Should go pretty quickly. I don't expect to have to explain much at all. I've said most of it, and we'll just run down the text. So, thanks, guys. Have a good day. Have a good week. Just hanging out for the title cards. Bye. See you soon.